Well, hi there, and welcome to the third session in our study in the book of 2 Timothy. This session is called Contending for the Gospel. So far in this little letter, we've seen that the old gospel minister Paul is passing on the baton of gospel ministry to the young Timothy, who's been established as the pastor at the church in Ephesus. So far, he's reminded Timothy of the beautiful way in which he has received the gospel, how it has reproduced itself in his life through his grandmother and his mother. And then Paul has gone on to explain that Timothy himself is supposed to reproduce that gospel in the life of other people, to find capable men with which he can share the gospel accurately so that they in turn can share the gospel with other people. Well, one thing that plagued the early church was the fact that not everybody was teaching the truth of the gospel. There were some people who couldn't separate themselves from the philosophies and the religion that they'd grown up their whole lives with, and so they were kind of merging Jesus and the Christian message into their old ways of thought. There were others who were just simply seeking to take this new church for a ride, find out how they could gain for themselves through teaching the message of Jesus. And so what is young gospel minister Timothy to do in a situation where these false teachers could be coming up and plaguing his church? Well, that's what this passage that we're going to look at explains in today's study. And one of the first things that we see is that Paul calls Timothy to avoid quarrelsome chatter, to avoid talk that's futile, and to avoid things that are just, outside, irreverent babble, he calls them, things that have nothing to do with the truth of who Jesus is. Instead, Paul calls Timothy to, verse 15, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. So instead of getting caught up in controversies and quarrels, Timothy is to set his mind to the task of rightly handling the word of truth, digging in and understanding the gospel and rightly handling it, rightly teaching it, explaining it to the people. So he is to give a positive account for the gospel of Jesus Christ that would cut through all of that irreverent babble. Paul actually has some fairly extreme and vivid imagery to explain what would happen if these controversies, these quarrels, this irreverent babble continued to just plague the church. He says it will spread like gangrene, a festering of the flesh that would eventually choke out and kill the body. Extreme language, but that is the danger that false teaching posed to the early church. In fact, Paul even names two people in this passage who have shipwrecked their faith, who have tried to skew the church in a different direction and have upset the faith of many people. Verse 17, among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have swerved from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already happened. They are upsetting the faith of some. Or against the backdrop of the bad example of these two false teachers, Paul calls Timothy to a whole new way of doing ministry. Timothy in verse 22 is told, flee the youthful passions, pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Paul calls Timothy to a whole new way of living as he does gospel ministry. The false teachers, well, they're just in it for their own gain, but Timothy is to flee these kinds of fleshy, youthful passions, and instead he's to pursue things that are godly, things that are righteous. And while we might forgive Timothy for feeling a huge dose of righteous anger and rage towards these men who had perpetrated false teaching and brought great harm to the household of God, Paul actually calls Timothy not to treat these men with harsh cruelty, but to see them as redeemable. And that there might be some way in which Timothy can interact with them and their teaching that might bring about restoration. Verse 24, and the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth. Do you see how Paul is calling Timothy not to let the false teaching impact how he acts as a gospel minister? And that's the heart of contending for the gospel. It's not some fiery, angry rage against false teachers that are out there. It's not just about naming and shaming those who teach a different gospel. The desire of God is to see people brought to the truth, to see people's hearts changed by the truth. And in the actions of a patient, kind, gentle gospel minister, there's a chance for those who have maybe gone askew with the gospel to be restored. False teaching still exists in the church today. There will still be those who skew the gospel for their own gain. But it's my hope in this study that we might see something of Paul's heart in his instruction to Timothy that might help us deal with the blight that is false teaching.